Everybody's fasting, they don't have the strength to come.
I know. I'm resisting the temptation to say, now we see who the Jews here for the
True.
No, it's amazing that everybody is still here and great to be learning today. So yes, it's the fast of Esther, and I was debating two things. One would be to do a lesson on the fast of Esther, on Tanit Esther, but I couldn't really find many midrashim that I wanted to teach about it. And after all, this is a class on Midrash and not just a generic class. So I avoided that temptation, and instead we're going to keep the focus on Purim.
Teach anything from Haggadah. From the Megillah, because the entire thing is a Midrash.
I love your expansive definition, yeah. But here's where we'll begin. We'll begin with an opening question, which is, well, actually, we'll open with a brief story, which is one of my favorite, and I don't know if you've experienced this. Welcome. Great to see you, Judy. Good. One of my favorite times of Purim growing up in my synagogue at home was when the cantor would do a full headstand. Has this happened here, or is it something that you guys grew up? He would stand on his head like Ben Gurion on the beach.
No, Toby Rosenberg reads the Megillah standing on her.
Yeah.
Wow.
Toby was always
Toby.
on it.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it was always just a spectacle and it's part of the festivity, but it's also deeply meaningful because on Purim, everything is hafuch, right? Everything was turned upside on its head, right? The world was turned upside down. Haman's decree was flipped on its head. The gallows he built, he was hung on, right? So there's all of this. Welcome. Great to see you again. So obviously we don't have food today for the fast of Esther, but we persist regardless. But right, so I always loved this handstand. So the opening question for you is Purim, which is all about, in a way, imbalance, how everything can be turned on a dime or flipped on its head, ends up oddly and interestingly being a holiday that brings balance in many different ways. And we're going to dive into that. So if that seems abstract, we'll make it more concrete. But opening question for you is, are there any ways in which Purim offers you balance, either in the story, the mitzvot, the rituals that we do on Purim? Is there what about it brings any balance? And since there's no time to since we don't have food to make a plate, we'll just dive right into it. Go ahead.
Into the world today,
Okay.
if you can call that balance.
Right. You would, I think you could say the world today feels very imbalanced, but how does it bring you into the world today? Just given
The
Amalek.
anti-Semitism and everything else.
Yeah. So good. It feels perennially relevant. Yeah. Right. And it feels eerily relevant this time around with Hamas and Haman and Amalek and this attempt to annihilate us. And so in some way, maybe it brings you balance because maybe it brings you a sense of hope of, you know what, every generation there's an Amalek who rises against us and yet we prevail. And so maybe that gives you some morsel of balance and hope. That's great. That's a lovely answer. Hi, Alina, welcome. Great to see you. And Amanda and Nelson, good to see you guys. So I know you, the other two, you guys heard the question, but it's how does Purim bring you balance? Hey, Amanda. Welcome. Do you have an answer? Go for it. Are you just saying hi or do you have an answer?
No, I'm saying hi.
Oh, okay, great. Well, hi. Great to see you.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to share? David, I saw your hand.
Well, it was just said at the end of your response to what Sheila said, so there's nothing else to add.
Got it. Okay. Great. Yes.
I think it also, I relate to Esther in that the courage and the fortitude that she took, and she fasted 3 days,
Yes, that's right.
that it's encouraging to, use her as a role model because since her time, there have been many women who have stood up, have fortitude and persevere, to overcome a wrong.
Lovely. So Nina, so the Esther's courage as a woman leader, which is, disproportionate, imbalanced in our tradition and in our world, looking to her courage and position of power and how she used it, that brings you some sense of correcting an imbalance and maybe also gives you that sense of like inspiration,
Strength.
and inspiration. That's great. Yeah.
Now I do have something
Okay.
to add. Thank you, Gina. I think this story instructs us a little bit about, albeit that it's a kind of a wild story in many ways. It instructs us a little bit about living in Galut. So,
Living in exile.
and I'll give some concrete examples. One is, this is following the first exile, which is a relatively short exile. And yet the main characters already have, in addition to their Hebrew names, if you will, non-Hebrew names, which are ironically now Hebrew names, but Mordecai is Marduk, a god of Babylonia, and Esther is Ishtar, a goddess of Babylonia. Interestingly enough. So we see this ability to wear a name for the community in which we live and wear a different name for our own community, so to speak. And I think that says something about living as a minority outside of Israel.
Interesting. So finding balance in Galut and exile, balancing sort of the assimilation versus identity. The balances and imbalances of maintaining a complex identity.
The other thing I wanted to say, and then I'll
Multifaceted.
is, and this is based on the learning we did with Arnie Rose in the Shabbat morning class. There's some concern this year, he says, and I think you can see some of this here and there, about how do we celebrate Purim
Right.
while things are going on in Gaza. Does it have a bad look, so to speak, particularly if the message outside the Jewish community isn't as subtle as the message within the Jewish community?
Right.
So I would say, my initial reaction is, well, if you look at the story, it doesn't say the Jews killed everyone. What it basically says is anybody who came to attack the Jews got to attack back, and the Jews succeeded, thank God.
No, he said
So,
it does not say that they attacked back. In other words, they were given permission to. There was something in it where the Jews didn't quite.
he may have
slaughter.
said that, but if you read the Megillah, it seems pretty obvious that the Jews attacked back. Whether they attacked back or not, their enemies were killed. Who killed them? I think it was the Jews, but we could have an argument about that
But they
maybe
were killing
another
each
time.
other because they didn't, yeah.
But my point is, and it's a difficult point to make even now, but again, maybe the story is providing us some kind of perspective to use in the current situation.
Right.
As one of the things I said or was going to say, and I think decided not to because that class went so much overtime, was that we don't get any credit. That is to say, the Israelis don't get any credit. Let's say the numbers actually are approaching 30,000, and let's say that a number of those people are sadly civilians, even though Israel argues that at least some 10,000 of them are Hamas combatants. If you compare that to what the United States does in the region, mainly from the air to protect our own soldiers before we ever send any soldiers in, then Israel should have killed in this conflict at least 200,000, if not close to 1 million Palestinians. I'm not saying that there aren't problems on the ground. I'm just saying that if you have a perspective on what's happening and the reality that Hamas operates behind human shields and always has, and that the tunnel network itself, because the entrances and exits are located in places like schools and hospitals, this is a very difficult ground operation. And we can argue about whether it's necessary or not, and we can argue about the world's reaction to it or not. But the interesting thing in the Purim story, which was not where we are right now in the Gaza story, is that if I remember correctly, several people, quote, profess themselves to be Jews, close quote. after the triumph, if you will, over the anti-Semites. Is that there just for fancy? In a way, I mean, the whole story is somewhat fanciful, and later on, if we have time and it makes sense, I'll bring in something from the essentially Catholic practice of carnival as a comparison point, but this is something, you know, in a sense for us. So does that provide balance? Does it provide perspective? You all have to decide for yourselves, but it's there. And it's a challenge, whether it provides perspective or balance or not, but it's there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that that's a question on many of our minds going into Purim is how do we celebrate it or how do we hold it up to what's going on right now in Israel and Gaza? So I'm hoping that the sources we bring today will give us some more insight into Purim itself, so that the less it feels like it's just pure celebration and drinking and carnival in the midst of death and heartbreak and tragedy and, you know, everything we're going through. The more I think it feels appropriate to celebrate it, because the more we can latch on to all these different meanings that it offers and the different way it balances out, not even just our own like more abstract ideas like we're talking about, but other holidays. And you see it as like as a piece that brings balance to other holidays that we celebrate in relationship to other holidays, the more it feels like this necessary, meaningful day that is not just this party where we drink and have fun. So I'm gonna get the source sheet up onto the Zoom so you can follow along. Hey, welcome. Great to see you guys. We were actually just about to start with the sheet, so you haven't missed any of the texts yet.
Yeah.
Okay. Here we go. So let's dive in. So the first thing I want to talk about is how, going off of that relationship to other holidays, how Purim comes to balance Yom Kippur. And then from there, we're going to go how Purim balances Pesach. And finally, how Purim balances our relationship with God. So those are sort of the three pillars of today's session. But the first is, when people think about connections between Purim and Yom Kippur, what do you think of? Are there any connections, either similarities or vast differences between Purim and Yom Kippur? The name, right? The first thing, Yom HaKippurim, the rabbis note, it's Yom HaKippurim. It is like, like is like. So it's a day like Purim. That Yom Kippur is a day like Purim. But you would think that that's not at all the case, because if you had to think of two vastly polar opposite holidays, you might come up with Purim and Yom Kippur. On Purim, it's feasting, it's celebrating, it's a very physical holiday. Yom Kippur, you deprive yourselves of those things. It's a very spiritual holiday. It's not about, but you afflict your souls, right? You're not partying. So how are they similar?
Rabbi,
Hey, Jerry, welcome. Yes.
again, going back to Esther, she indeed had a Purim for
Mhm.
3 days because she had to cleanse herself.
She had a Yom
fasted.
Kippur for 3 days.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, she had a Yom Kippur for 3 days. She had to completely cleanse herself, praying for her life, which we do on Yom Kippur because the doors are closed.
Right.
So very similar there, we cleanse by no food and abstain from everything. So I think it's very similar.
That's great. So Ta'anit Esther today balances Purim, which balances Yom Kippur,
Is
right?
that why it's 3 days before?
Yes, well, it was no. Usually it's the day before, but
Oh, Shabbat.
yeah, you can't fast on Shabbat, so they move it early.
That's done on Friday.
Right. In preparation. Yeah. Right, but okay, so good. So you're pointing not to Purim itself, but to the Purim story where Esther fasts before approaching King Ahasuerus. which is also a very good connection to Yom Kippur, because on Yom Kippur,
Mhm.
we approach the king, God, right? So, and we're fasting before we approach the king. So to Esther fasting before she approaches the
It's
king. Good.
interesting.
They both involve to a certain extent life,
Mhm.
existence.
Nice,
Whether it's humming or we pray to God for another year.
good. And that also brings this balance back into play, because what do we say on Yom Kippur? That our lives hang in the balance, right? But both Purim and Yom Kippur are this existential threat. They're different threats, as our sources are gonna say, in nature. The threats are different. What is being threatened is different on Yom Kippur than on Purim. But still, this idea of literally hanging in a balance and the stakes being that high. Yes. Brother
You
Sheila.
also, yeah, much later on with the custom of, the girl going out in the afternoon or something and,
Nice.
sort of
Night.
trying to do some matchmaking there.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
you have
Mm.
the, contest to become queen.
Oh, nice. I was going somewhere else with that, but I like that. So you're linking the when Ahasuerus needs a new queen, and so they put on a contest to at the end of Yom Kippur, when it says that the maidens would go out and there was a matchmaking ceremony kind of thing. So that's really interesting. What I thought you were gonna say is that Yom Kippur actually contains a lot of joy. In America in particular, we don't lean into the joy. In Israel, they really do. Rabbi Alex always says that the most joyful Yom Kippur she had was in Israel. And I don't know, the Israelis in the room, what your experience with Yom Kippur. Well, I will say hers was sort of extreme. She did it was a week-long retreat where it was actually a silent meditation beforehand, like a silence retreat where they didn't speak for days.
For a week?
Yeah, except for Yom Kippur when they actually davened and prayed, but it was so ecstatic. For one thing, because it was the first time they could actually speak. But no, I myself, I have experienced Yom Kippurs where there is like, even though you're fasting, there is this joy in the fact that the slate is wiped clean and that you get another chance. At the end of the day, this isn't Tisha B'Av. This isn't mourning the destruction of the temple. This is while you're afflicting your soul, which means fasting. You are celebrating the fact that, you know, you hope you get inscribed in the book of life and that you get a new chance. So they're both, Yom Kippur contains both. I would make the argument, for better or for worse, that in America, we really lean into the affliction part of it and the the solemnity of it. But there is this joy that I think needs to be tapped back into. Sheila, then David, yeah.
But Yom Kippur, you can say, one of the things is that everybody, while they're all trying to wipe the slate clean, they are not alone in wiping the slate clean. You're in a whole community where, hey, every one of us has sinned and we're all guilty.
Yeah.
And so you didn't feel like, I don't know, I'm the kind who, my husband used to call me a Pollyanna. If I know other people are suffering the same way, then I don't feel so bad.
Yes, right. Schadenfreude. Well, no, it's actually more just misery loves company.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So to make another comparison, the lots, the poor are drawn months and months.
Yes.
Before the event is supposed to happen.
Right.
So the Jews in the Persian Empire have a long time to quake in fear. Maybe on Yom Kippur, it's a shorter time, but in a sense, we're quaking because it's very serious.
Nice.
On the other hand, by the time this Purim story is over, there is deliverance.
Mhm.
And by the time Yom Kippur is over, you feel a sense of lightness because your soul is unburdened, if
Yes.
you will. So when we leave, and for me, it's an extremely powerful thing. And I'm sure this is why the rabbis do this, but when we're saying Hashem Hu Elohim 7 times at the end, of course, I can't help but think of the story of the contest with the prophets of Baal, where after Eliyahu is successful, the entire people spontaneously shout out Hashem Hu Elohim.
Mhm.
And then we are leaving the room, as Sheila says, together.
Mhm.
Some of us stop for a cracker, some of us maybe have crackers in the car, some of us are heading to a break the fast as ever we possibly can. But it seems like we get there that fast in part because we're just so unburdened,
That's
so
nice.
lightened,
Yeah.
and so were the people who survived the Haman's threats,
Right.
which come over them not for a day, but for almost a
Yeah.
year.
There is a relief at the end. That's makes you lighthearted.
But-
Yeah.
The big difference here is on Purim, yeah, you were spreading for a year, but then you knew that it was over at Purim. In the case of Yom Kippur, you've unburdened yourself and you say, well, there's nothing left I can do about last year anymore, but it's a whole year until you know whether you succeeded.
Hmm.
Because
But the thing is, you know, we're always saying that God is a forgiving God, and how do we even know that? I think it's because of Yom Kippur. I mean, I hear some people criticize Judaism, oh, they fast, they're sitting in a synagogue all day long, and what a down religion, you know, that's really not down. In the end of the day, it's that we have confidence in God.
Yeah.
I mean, as Sheila says, we all know we're sinners and we miss the mark. We miss the mark year after year after year. But
We admit
thank,
it.
yeah, we
admit it.
we admit it, and thank God gives us a day of atonement to
Yes.
try to make up for
But I
it.
also want to respond to something else you said, then we're gonna dive into the text, but there's text. The other thing you said is casting lots, right? We know that in Purim, Haman cast lots for when the Jews are gonna be annihilated. But then in Yom Kippur, we also cast lots, which is the high priest would cast lots for the two goats, right? One is off for Azazel in the wilderness, and the other is to be the scapegoat for that is the scapegoat for the people of Israel once the sacrifice, right? So, so there is this Purim aspect too, which means casting lots, that is there in both. Let's dive in. Who wants to read? This is from Midrash Mishlei, so from Proverbs, Midrash on the book of Proverbs. Go for it, thanks.
All of the holidays are to be nullified in the future, but the days of Purim will not be nullified, as it is stated. And these days of Purim will not be rescinded from the Jews. Rabbi Elazar said, also Yom Kippur will forever not be nullified, as it is stated, and it will be to you for an everlasting statute to atone for the children of Israel from all of their sins once a year.
Okay, so the rabbis are saying that there will be no need for just about every holiday in the future being like a messianic era where there is peace and there is safety and we're secure in our own land, right? That we don't need to observe the holidays that are either longing for that time or in response to suffering and tragedy or things like that, we actually don't need them because we live in this idyllic time. However, there are two holidays that we will continue to celebrate forever. One of them, the first of which actually is Purim, which you might not think you're like that one. But yeah, Purim is the one that we get to celebrate forever. And the proof of that is brought from the Megillah, which is in these days of Purim will not be rescinded from the Jews. So it's finding proof within the story itself where it says that. But then also Rabbi Elazar says same thing with Yom Kippur, because it says that it will not, and this is from Leviticus, it will be to you for an everlasting statute. So we know that they're forever. Why is that significant? I want to jump into the Maharal now. The Maharal wrote the Or Hadash. It's commentary on the book of Esther. It was composed at the end of the 16th century, so like 1590, 1600. Who wants to jump in? Maharal of Prague. He's from Prague. Oh, let me dive down. Yeah, thanks. Any volunteers? Go for it.
And Yom Kippur is the opposite because we abstain from physical pleasures like eating and drinking, bathing and anointing, to wear sandals and to have sex. This is because Yom Kippur atones for sins and transgressions which cause one's soul to be cut off from the community. Just like the days of Purim come since Haman sought to annihilate the Jews and the Holy Blessed One saved them, so too the adversary, who is the enemy of humanity, seeks to destroy the soul and nullify it, but the Holy Blessed One saves us from it. And from this is the reason that even Yom Kippur will never be nullified, because if there wasn't Yom Kippur, they would be lost before the oppressor who stands to destroy them spiritually, just like Haman stood against them to destroy them physically. but the Holy Blessed One saved us from his hand.
Great. So I think,
I have a question on your translation. Is adversary Hasatan?
yeah, although
And
here,
what's a-
no, in
and
the
what's a
Hebrew,
press?
it's actually Samael, but also this like adversary angel.
Okay, and what's oppressor?
Same thing. It's just it's Hatzorer here, but it's still referring to Samael, who is this like adversary angel kind of
So
thing.
it's not Hasatan.
No, in this case, it's not literally Hasatan,
Okay.
the accuser,
Now,
but
now
it's
you
still
can, now you
the.
can go on and
Yeah.
teach.
Well, so I think the main takeaway here is it's further elucidating how Purim and Yom Kippur must be understood as a complete set. That without the other, one is not fully complete. And the way is spiritual and physical. That on Yom Kippur, there is a very real spiritual threat, which is the adversary, let's call it Yetzer Hara, right? Our evil inclination that seeks to destroy us, to put us down, to fall us prey to all of this, the temptations and transgressions, right? But Yom Kippur is a day where we celebrate sort of the ability to overcome that part of ourselves, or to seek forgiveness and atonement for the ways in which we inevitably fall short. And so God, who atones for our sins on Yom Kippur, saves us from this spiritual Haman, which is the Yetzer Hara. But on Purim, it's physical, right? It is celebrating the being saved from the physical existential threat of Haman trying to physically annihilate the Jewish people, right? So we can see how both are are commemorating the same threat, but attacking us in different ways. One, the soul, and the other, the body.
But nowhere in the Purim literature is God mentioned by name.
Right.
That's in the next text.
That is the next. Right. In our final text, we're going to talk about how Purim comes to balance our relationship with God. But it's a great point. So we're going to come back to that. Right. So that's number one. And then you can see it just goes on. So Yom Kippur is opposite from Purim. On Purim, we're drinking, we're feasting, we're celebrating. But Yom Kippur is opposite because we abstain from all that, right? We don't do those things on Yom Kippur. And that's because this is about the threat of being spiritually cut off, the way sins, karet, being spiritually cut off from the community. And so we observe it through spiritual means. We deprive our body of the physical to try to sort of become angels. And that's sort of what I thought when David said that we get to break fast so quickly, in part because we're so hungry, but in part because we've just spent the day being angels. We're literally flying off to break fast. But that is the idea. On Yom Kippur, you're supposed to mimic the angels who don't need food, who can praise God all day, who wear white, who, that's sort of the image that's evoked. But so we're praising God with our spirit. But as Jews, how beautiful that we don't denigrate the body. Just because we elevate the spirit on Yom Kippur, it's not meant in the course of a Jewish year to denigrate the Jewish body. And so we balance it out by having a holiday that's dedicated to physical enjoyments and pleasures. And we should indulge in the blessings and bounties of life if we're fortunate enough to have that. And it's not just, and furthermore, that is a way of praising God. To praise God, if you only did it with your soul, and to a certain extent, that's not enough. As human beings, you want to engage your entire being in praise of God. And so Purim gives us that opportunity. Yes.
So two things. One is a question, as somebody who's interested in the sort of historical aspects of all this. It seems like one of the things that happens over time is there's a sort of accretion of more specifics about angels than ever seems to be the case in the Torah itself. So when does Samael as a concept start in Judaism?
It's a great question, and I needed more prep for that one. In the back of my head, I was like, I hope nobody pushes me on Samael, because I'm not but it's not the first time that we've had questions about angelology in this class. And maybe we can dedicate a session to angelology. So I'm good. I know I sort of teased that a while back, but I want to actually come through with that.
The second thing is also part of comment and part of question. When we're kind of talking about these juxtapositions, I'm trying to think in my head, what are some of the other possible juxtapositions? So it occurred to me that if we think of two New Years, one at the beginning of the seventh month and one at the beginning of the first month. Interestingly, Purim is coming before the spring New Year, if you will, and Yom Kippur is coming after the fall New Year, if you will. So does anybody ever make anything about, in terms of these sorts of opposites aren't that opposite after all? One comes before and the other comes after. I don't know, but it just occurred to me.
No, I think that's a really great point. Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, I think the rabbis do, as you can see, like they're doing with Purim, put it in the context of other holidays and see how everything seems to add color to the other. So yeah, no, I think it's a great way to think, Jerry.
My problem with it is that Esther really is an imperfect role model. We're not told what she had to do to become the queen, but we can imagine what the tryouts were.
Can.
Just a whole test.
And
We'll make a movie of it.
we have no indication that she in any way practiced as a Jewish person during any of the time that she was the queen. And of course, she didn't
Yeah,
step up to say she's going to go ahead and save the Jews. She had to be coerced into it by her uncle. So it seems to me there must be other Jewish women or the scenarios where Jews are saved that maybe are better.
yeah. We'd say there must be other, what?
Scenarios where Jews are saved, where
What
the
did you say right
physical
before that?
parts,
I didn't hear right before that. If you-
there must be better role models to choose
Yeah,
For a heroine.
for a heroine.
for a heroine.
Or
Okay, that's right, yeah.
even a hero, someone who physically saved the Jewish people is what you're saying.
Yeah,
That's-
well, yeah, no, it's interesting. So first you said there's a Midrash, so go ahead.
That Esther was the one I'm thinking of, she was a vegetarian while she was in the king's palace. So she was attempting to follow kashrut.
Yeah, they're actually, the rabbis turn her into a very observant Jew in the palace. First of all, they say, going back to what you were saying about the tryouts, they say that she made herself kakarka, which means like the earth, basically meaning that she was very passive, like that it was like obviously part of what it was the relationship, it was part of what, but she did not, she was very passive in the process, as if to say that, you know, she did her duty, but it was not something that she enjoyed or had
Yeah.
an active role in.
Yeah. Saving from sex. Oh, the king says, come, you come.
Yeah, so, right, so,
Unless your name.
but yeah, so they actually do, the rabbi, even though it's not in the Megillah itself, the rabbis do in the Midrash conceive of her as being very observant and safeguarding her Judaism, even though it had to be hidden for the sake of the plot to move forward, the whole plan. David, yes.
I think picking up on what Jerry said, thank you, Jerry. A lot of times when we get a story like this, we use the word sanitized to describe the story. Everything seems to work out. We talk about the contest, for example. It occurs to me that it's very easy to read this as not a contest at all, but a bunch of soldiers come to the town. They grab the beautiful women, or at least the ones they think are beautiful, or at least the ones they think Ahasuerus think would be beautiful. They're all gathered together in what might be considered a pen. And then they get to go one at a time for what Jerry was talking about.
Yeah.
So if there's any reality, the reality isn't quite as pleasant as the gloss in the story.
Yeah,
Similarly, the story seems to imply that the enemies who at least tried to attack the Jews are all destroyed, and it doesn't seem that there are any Jewish casualties at all. And everybody wants to say, well, poor, that's just a fable anyway. Then you get the Holocaust, and maybe it's not a fable anymore. But it's also certainly the case that plenty of Jews died, even though, thank God, the Nazis were defeated. So sometimes reality, as opposed to the way a story might get told,
right.
aren't quite the same.
Right. There is something about this story that's very intentionally feels not as grounded and feels extreme and sort of um, hyperbolic.
Like a fairy tale, actually.
Yeah, and I think that is in a sense by design. So I think it's important to revisit these stories, because especially when you learn them as a kid, it's told a certain way. Like we don't even teach chapter 10, right? Which is when the Jews strike back.
David, this, I think was sanitizing for, because of children, this became a children's holiday, a
Right.
children's story. so
Yeah.
We have to say.
Right.
And along that line, you just started to say, there is a whole explanation. It was on the seminary has these programs on Monday. I don't know how many people
Yeah, we saw it.
get it on the email,
So.
but there was one, I think it was last week, just watched it yesterday, by Rabbi Kohler, Aaron Kohler. And he discusses, he makes the comparison, where do we get this from?
Mhm.
And he is comparing, he is showing this a whole different segment. In other words, this is a parallel story to another Exodus, to Pesach.
Mhm.
Purim and Pesach are put together, just like Sukkot isn't celebrated. What do we celebrate instead of Sukkot? When do we celebrate it?
Because they had.
And Purim is when all, Pesach is when all this took place.
Mhm.
But when was it celebrated? Purim. He makes,
Good, yeah, no,
but there are reasons for things in the story.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting.
no, that is great. So let's go ahead and use that as a segue to Pesach. Jerry, will you turn the light off?
Flashlights on.
Your flashing flash.
Yeah. Let's make it, and I think we Jews do a great job, and I give the rabbis deserve a lot of credit for being able to make useful stories for us in their own times of trouble, if you will. So I think we'd be remiss if we didn't say that part of what's also going on is this story is being written at a time when the Persian Empire is still dominant, and in fact, we know that the Babylonian Talmud is being written in the context of Persian domination, just as maybe the Yerushalmi is being written in the context of Roman domination.
Yes.
So many of us have learned about pages being torn out of one Talmud or another by the authorities, and have heard all kinds of stories about, for example, where did the game of dreidel come from, or why do we say certain prayers in certain ways. I think it could be argued that part of what's going on is maybe want to protect our children, but we also want to make sure the story doesn't go away. So the story needs to be fanciful enough that the Persians don't suppress it.
Right, right. Again, a delicate balance. Yeah. Nelson, go ahead.
Well, I would want to link it to Pesach in some somewhat different kind of way. So in two ways. One is that beginning of the month for Pesach is the New Year's of the King, and Purim shows the limitation of a king, even an enormously powerful Persian king. He can't. He's manipulated by his advisors, by his first wife, by Esther. He's just not in control. If you're a king, you don't quite get to do all the things you think you might be able to do. And the other part is, and then maybe this is too much influence in my own mind from what Christians do, but Pesach is a celebration before the fast of Pesach. Pesach is a fast. You don't eat any bread. Eat matzah, but abstain from bread for 8 days. And that's a kind of like a semi-fast.
That's nice. There's also the literal fast of the firstborn that precedes it, just like there's Tanit Esther that precedes Purim. So that's another great tie. But I like that king emphasis. I hadn't thought of that before. King Ahasuerus, King Pharaoh, these failed kings that should open us up to this relationship with God as our sovereign. And yet we keep going back to a king. We keep wanting a king, which actually is what gets us to Purim in the first place. Because then you go to King Saul, and King Saul doesn't kill the king of Amalek, And because he doesn't kill the king of Amalek, you get Haman, because that he comes from, so it's sort of, again, like just
That,
be warned if you want a king. Right, over and over again. So that's great.
that's what Kohler, he starts the whole thing, the comparison, the.
Yeah.
It's league Pharaoh, and in other words, I don't want to botch it, but it's, for Pesach, we talk about the Davidic lineage. When it comes to Purim, we talk about, we go back to Shaul and the Agagite.
Yeah.
And all that. So there's a whole, and if you see it, you can explain it.
Yeah, no, it sounds great. It sounds really interesting.
What, Nelson was saying, he's on to it,
Yes.
that this was an exodus, but it was a different kind of exodus. In the other exodus, we actually left from Pesach, we left Egypt.
Mhm.
In this one, we had already left and were in Babylonia.
Mhm.
But we remained in Babylonia for an awfully long time.
Right,
In those days, 400 years, this was a long time.
right.
And, so, as I said, I don't want to botch too much, but it would be interesting if you.
No, that's right. And if you were at the Sunshine Social at Wiggins. Yeah, we talked about this and how there are different miracles that happen, and the nature of, just like with Purim and Yom Kippur, you get body and soul. With Pesach and Purim, the miracle of Pesach comes from above. God splits the sea, performs 10 plagues. It's all these miracles, supernatural. But then in Pesach, in Purim, it comes from natural miracles, right? What people, and that's going back to Jackie's point, that God isn't even mentioned in the Purim story. Whereas who's not mentioned in the Haggadah? Moshe. So it's as if to emphasize that in Purim, these are very tangible, like people stood up in times that they needed, and you can't just wait around for God to alter the course of history. You need to be a partner for God and take a stand. So much so that God isn't even mentioned in Purim. But then in Pesach, it's the opposite. But also, don't lose sight of your, don't lose faith in the miraculous and being in a relationship with God who can perform wonders. And so you have that balance. If you only had one, I think it's missing out, right? If you only believe that, it's everything is on us. And I think that's a safer, if you had to choose one, honestly, I would choose Purim, which says, we can't just wait around for God to solve everything.
Yeah.
But if that's our only belief, then we miss out on this sort of taking a step into a leap of faith into, but I'm not alone in this work.
We need partnership with God.
Yeah, I need the divine in this. And maybe I'm getting closer to the divine through this. So I think that's a lovely, lovely balance. Going back to what Jerry said, and then I'll get to David again. Jerry, when you said, do we have some more inspirational feminine leaders, as opposed to Esther, who, while she certainly exhibited courage, was sort of a pawn in this game that men were playing. I would say, going to Pesach, you have Shifra and Puah, who are the first to really demonstrate civil disobedience. And when King Pharaoh says,
Yocheved and Miriam.
yes, and Yocheved and Miriam, that Pesach is chock full of women who are heroic and really paved the way. Even going back to that first Midrash, one of the first Midrashim we did, when Amram and Yocheved divorced Moses' parents, Miriam, his older sister, goes to her father, Amram, and says, Pharaoh is bad because Pharaoh decreed that all the firstborn males be cast into the sea. That was the exact law that Shifra and Puah, the midwives, rebel against. They refused to do that. They saved the children because they fear God. But Miriam says, so that was bad, but what you've done is worse, because by divorcing the wives, by not having hope to bring more children into the world, you're decreeing against the males and the females, and you're decreeing this world and the world to come. Pharaoh was only decreeing this world.
Let's not forget also Basha, because despite her father's decree, that she knows she's saving a Hebrew male.
Yeah.
Who she adopted.
It's about Pharaoh, yeah.
The other couple of things, one is picking up on what Sheila said, and the other on what Nelson said. So, I'll start with what Nelson said, only because I was wondering if there was a way of working this in, and I Nelson gave me an opening, so you can all blame Nelson. No, I'm just kidding. But there's an interesting, at least to me, rather old now, social history of southern France, written by a French professor whose name I can't remember, I'm sorry to say, called Carnival in Roman, if you will, in the South, where he goes to great lengths to explain what is Carnival all about? Why did this even start? What does this really have to do with anything? And his conclusion largely is that this turning everything on its head is a kind of once a year hope for, a peasant is just a peasant and will always be a peasant. But once a year, the peasant is the king and the king is the peasant. So we do see some of that in this story also. And picking up on what Sheila said, I think it may even be in Tractate Megillah. I sadly don't remember that specifically either. So I apologize for not having my sources in front of me. But one of the things the rabbis say at some point is that it's a son of Esther who says to the Jews, and for that matter, everybody else who's been exiled, go back where you came from and you can have your own worship. So the exile ends, in a sense, through the Purim story, therefore.
Well, that's interesting because, somebody had mentioned, I think it was Shu at the Wigan social, that one of the differences between Pesach and Purim is that Pesach ends with this path to the promised land or attaining the promised land and next year in Jerusalem. And so it's still maybe not fully there, that, ultimate redemption, but still there is the promised land crucial to the story of Pesach, whereas Purim, we're still in exile. At the end of the day, we defend ourselves, but there is no promise of a.
Well, we can at least say that historically the Jews were able to go back, and it was because the Persians allowed them. And I think the rabbis go as far.
That's right. So I like, you're right. It brings,
that the Persian king who did allow them was clearly a son of Esther.
Yes, I think that's interesting. Go ahead, Elliot.
An interesting image comes to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur liturgy, and God is the king. When it comes to that portion of the service, I envision God's the king, but he also needs mankind to officially crown him.
Yes, and there's a beautiful Midrash that we do that through our prayers, that there are angels that go around to each and every synagogue on the high holidays, collecting the prayers of the people, and then the angels go and tie them like a crown on the divine's head. So each prayer that you utter is contributing to this crown that the angels are weaving for God. But before we go into relationship with God, let's stay on Pesach and read this text. Who wants to read? This is from a contemporary 20th century rabbi, American who made Aliyah and then died in Jerusalem. This was also, is familiar if you're at Wiggins. We discussed this one. So again, how Purim is balancing Pesach. Does anybody want to read? Go for it.
This is also the reason for which none of the names of God are mentioned in Megillat Esther, since if God's name would be written explicitly, this would constitute a departure from the natural into the supernatural, which is applicable to Passover. Purim, however, reveals that each aspect within nature is imbued with the love of God. Where does one find more intense love? In Passover or in Purim? On Passover, God raises us over the entire world. But on Purim, we discover God in every nook and cranny of the natural world.
I really love this. And I love it for a number of reasons. One is, again, so we've already discussed the ways in which it's natural and supernatural. We've already made that delineation. But then this rabbi puts them in competition with one another and says, well, wait, which one is a more intense expression of God's love? When God basically, gets out of bed to perform miracles for us, you would think that that is the more intense form of love. But he's saying, no, it's the other. It's the one in which God allows us to try to search for God's miracles in every nook and cranny of the world. And that is actually, the natural miracles are actually a more intense iteration of God's love or manifestation of God's love than the supernatural ones, which I find really kind of fantastic. That Purim comes to reveal that each aspect within nature is imbued with the love of God. That if you were only waiting around for the big miracles, you would be missing the fact that actually everything around you is imbued with divinity and miracle. And and once you can tap into that, which is what Purim is trying to get us to tap into, then you find that more intense love and you see it everywhere. So part of why I'm bringing all this, and then we have one final text, is that Purim is so much more than just a carnivalesque holiday. And when you were saying, David, it made me think of Mel Brooks, who employs the carnivalesque as a film tool in all of his, which are parodies, right? Why do we do spiels on Purim? We do these parodies. We do what Mel Brooks did his entire career, right? And part of what that does is, while it plays with existing frameworks that we're familiar with, it takes them to the extreme, not just for the comedy, although that's a big part of it, big part of Mel Brooks, big part of Purim, but it reveals truth in a very potent way that only comedy and calling out the absurd and the carnivalesque can do. When you watch Blazing Saddles and you see the cartoonized versions of, these racist cowboys and all that, it is so extreme, but that is pointing to the absurdity, right? So I think similarly, it's a tool for diminishing anti-Semites and racists
Making them look foolish.
by making them look foolish. And that was actually Mel Brooks, who served in World War II, but not in combat, said that he felt there was a job left to be done, that he had unfinished business against the Nazis because he didn't get to physically. So what he did was he wrote Springtime for Hitler. He wrote The Producers, where he said, if I can minimize Nazis to the size of a joke, that is how you truly defeat something. And it's just funny because in describing his comedy, now I'm going on a Mel Brooks rant, but he said that as opposed to Woody Allen, here's again, let's put two people in balance and see how they're. Woody Allen, it describes his comedy as intellectual pirouettes. And that's so him, right? And if you ask what instrument did he play? He played the clarinet. Right, so that almost is like the music of his comedy, very Jewish, but it's also like the music of his comedy. If you were like, that's sort of how Mel Brooks, what instrument do you think he played? This big, broad.
Bass
He
drum.
played the drums. He was a drummer. But that's the sound of his comedy, right? But so he wanted to drop atomic bombs of laughter. That was what Mel Brooks was after, as opposed to the intellectual pirouettes. But that again is the imagery of bombs. That's how he was trying to wage war with the Nazis. But again, Purim employs that carnivalesque as a form of defeating the anti-Semites. And it does it through humor, which is an unconventional but very powerful weapon.
Jewish weapon.
A very Jewish weapon. Good. You remember it more, that's true. Jackie.
Of a play called The Lady's Not for Burning, where Christopher Rye, the poet, says, if you were God creating man, would you have had the inspiration to give him the gift of laughter?
Mm.
And that is what saves us. We can laugh at things.
Mm.
Yeah.
Right.
It takes place during witchcraft trials.
Mm.
And he talks about laughing.
Right.
The whole idea is laughable.
Right.
And-
Right. And so I don't want to minimize the real conflict and tension we feel, which is how can we laugh? How can we celebrate? How can we feel joy when there's so much suffering going on, when our hostages are still not home, when all of this death and destruction is happening? And that's very real. I don't mean to bring this as don't worry, you can laugh, because laugh is a powerful tool. At the same time, I do think that there is a holy purpose to the joy that Purim wants us to experience, and it's not frivolous. And that, I think, is an important distinction. I would say this is not a time for frivolity, but I wouldn't say that it's not a time for laughter when it's used for sacred and potent purposes. Go ahead, Sherry, and then I want to do our final text and then dismiss you.
Just a brief comment that for our own mental health, we need to step back from all the tragedy in the world and laugh.
Nice. That's true. That's true. Very well said. Welcome, welcome. We're just going to wrap up and then we'll let you go to Yiddish. But okay, now we've sort of hinted at this already, but now I want to get to how Purim balances our relationship with the divine. So, yeah, go ahead, Asa. Do you want to read?
And they stood at the lowermost part of the mountain.
This is when we're receiving the commandments. And this, by the way, is one of the most famous Midrashim we haven't covered yet in this class, but you may be familiar with. Go ahead.
Rabbi Avdini bar Hama bar Hassa said, the Jewish people actually stood beneath the mountain. And the verse teaches that the Holy Blessed One overturned the mountain above the Jews like a tub and said to them, if you accept the Torah, excellent. And if not, there will be your burial.
Yeah, this, right, basically very coerced, right? Not so subtle. God saying, accept this or die, basically. Go ahead.
Rabbi Aha bar Yaakov said, from here, there is a substantial caveat to the obligation to fulfill the Torah. The Jewish people can claim that they were coerced into accepting the Torah, and it is therefore not binding.
Good, I'm gonna pause one more time, just like with marriage, right? It must be consensual, right? Similarly here, okay, well, we married God at Sinai, we entered into this covenant, but there's a big safek, there's a big doubt cast into the legitimacy of it, because if we were coerced, it's not kosher. Okay, so how do we address that? Keep going.
Rava said, even so, they again accepted it willingly in the time of Ahasuerus. As it is written, the Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them. And he taught, the Jews ordained what they had already taken upon themselves through the Midrash.
So we get from this verse from the Megillah, and the Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all as such as joined upon themselves unto them. That there was for the first time, even though you could say na'aseh v'nishma, but the point is when they said we will do and we will do and we will hear all these words of the teaching, what the rabbis are saying is, well, they were coerced into doing that, so that wasn't valid. But then we read in the Megillah that the Jews took it upon themselves and they did so willingly. And so now that comes to finally repair this doubt cast in our relationship with God, with the covenant, to say, well, okay, now it's balanced. Because whereas before it wasn't balanced, God was literally holding a mountain over our heads, which I think is interesting, right? We could dive into that and say like, wait, that seems weird, that seems bad, it seemed angry, it doesn't seem, but it also, and all that is true, but I think it also speaks to the urgency, right? Of like, the world depends on, sort of like the world being flipped on its head, the world depends on you accepting Torah. Right, you have to do it, even if you don't want to, it is for the good of everyone and you need it. But it's sort of like na'aseh v'nishma, like first we'll do it, but then we'll learn and then we'll understand. So maybe this is not na'aseh v'nishma taking place chronologically, where like that first one was na'aseh, okay, we'll do it. But now when we get to Purim, we've sort of achieved the nishma piece. We've learned and we've willingly accepted upon ourselves. But that then also makes us consensual active partners, which completes that, makes it a healthy relationship.
It's like a parent and a children. At first you say, well, you have to do this.
Yeah,
And then they grow up and they realize that it was for the best and they accept it,
beautiful.
hopefully.
Which is interesting because this is coming at the heels of what was almost being annihilated because they were Jews, but ultimately wasn't.
Yeah.
Redemption. And then so maybe there is that final realization of, you know what, maybe as long as we're in this sacred community, sacred relationship, that we'll be okay. And we do need this and we take it on willingly.
It's also kind of interesting that Rabbi doesn't bring other midrashim that are counter to that, which certainly exist and existed, or even write his own. He decides the better way is to bring in this conclusion to the Purim text. I think that's felt pretty interesting.
Yeah, but I want you to see how Purim comes to serve a vitally important role in balancing out all of these different aspects of the Jewish calendar and within the Jewish soul, right? We get body and soul. That was our first text talking about how it balances Yom Kippur, which is about soul. Purim is about body. And so there you have both being balanced. And then we talk about with Pesach, the natural and the supernatural, how that balances out our sort of view of God working in the world and our role in it, and miracles, the nature of miracles. And then finally, how it balances even our relationship with God, God's self, that it finally comes to say, now this is we willfully take this upon ourselves. And when we celebrate Purim, we're celebrating this willful accepting of Torah and the covenant in this relationship. So Purim, which may get flack as trite or a quote unquote children's holiday or, you know, a carnival or all these things, actually has such integral and crucial role to play, not just in the Jewish calendar, but in looking at in a sense of internal balance. right? How we can be standing on our heads as we're supposed to do on Purim, as everything's, be fun and, but still be balanced as we're doing that. And the balance is key, not just the hafuch nature. Balance is also key. So thank you, everybody, for learning. I always love it and enjoy our time together and Chag Purim Sameach.
It's a complicated spelling.
Yeah, thank you, Helena. Thank you. It is a compliment.
And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's all verse 27 says.